Welcome to Theology Thursday, a weekly podcast dedicated to cultivating theological conversations amongst millennials. I'm your host, Connor Grubbs, and today's episode is going to be a little bit different than what you're used to. Ryan and Johnny will not be joining us today. We are doing an interview-style podcast. We have a special guest on today, Scott Mahurin, founder and president of Florida Preborn Rescue, and we're going to be talking about abortion and a pro-life biblical stance on that. Scott, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, we appreciate your time being here today. So, for our listeners who don't know, what is Florida Preborn Rescue?
Well, Connor, Florida Preborn Rescue is a pro-life, Christ-centered sidewalk counseling ministry based here in St. Petersburg, Florida. And what sidewalk counseling is, it's basically just offering help to women as they're entering abortion clinics. So we're not a pregnancy center or a crisis center like that, but we are. Sidewalk counseling is just Christians who offer help to women as they enter the abortion clinics in a Christ honoring way.
Mm. So, Are you able to stay in connection with other ministries that are crisis centers and stuff like that to get people connected as like a follow-up, for that?
Yes, we work closely with New Life Solutions and the Next Step Pregnancy Center. Basically, the information that we give out to the women has addresses of all the different pregnancy centers in the area so that they can pick one to go to. But I do work closely with Saul Pichon and Carol Alexander and ministry leaders like that too. So
how do you get people out there in front of the abortion clinics? Is that do you recruit volunteers?
Yeah, I'm pretty active on social media, and how I have a crew of about between 6 to 8 from my church and some other churches who sort of saw what I was doing, had either done this in the past and had stopped doing it. And so when I started going about 8 years ago, people sort of followed me to the sidewalk as well. And I teach sidewalk counseling classes. I've done presentations at churches before to kind of raise awareness, and we get people to come out from those too.
So could you share a little bit about maybe some statistics from your ministry last year, some kind of, to give an idea of some of the things y'all have accomplished for our listeners?
Sure. Well, I was a teacher for 18 years in Christian schools, in Christian ministry, and I retired from teaching last August, and so I've been full-time for a year now. And in the last year, we've offered help to about 400 different women at 3 different abortion clinics here in St. Pete. Mm. And we've given information to about 80 to 100 women. And we've seen 2 women that chose to keep their babies. Wow. And so we're very thankful for that.
Praise God.
The statistics are, sidewalk counseling is one of those things where I like to make the analogy that it's sort of like those telephones up on the Skyway Bridge on the way to Bradenton or South Florida. We can't make someone pick up the phone and call, but the phone is there if they have if they're thinking about killing themselves or whatever. The phone's there for them. There's options available for them, right. And we can't make the person take the information, but we just are there to offer help.
Sure.
And so most women, by the time they get to the clinic, have already sort of mentally and spiritually done. They've already had the abortion. They're just sort of there to do it, and most women are not really in a place to want to talk to us. But we're there for the women who are on the fence, who are conflicted, who are maybe just confused. And what's amazing, Connor, is you can see it. You can see the different places the women are at just on their faces as they walk in. You can see the women who are really hardened and who are just determined to abort their child. You see the women who are really sad and afraid. You see it on their faces before they even enter the clinic. And so our job is just to offer that help. But yes, 400 women were offered help. 80 to 100 received information, and we had 2 saves last year. And if you go back since I started this 6 years ago, we've had 12 saves, We've had, got to be up to 1,000, maybe 1,200 women that we've offered help to. And so we're definitely having an impact there at the clinics here in St. Pete.
Praise God. That's awesome. And so, along the lines of what you're saying, how some people that are coming in, they've already made up their minds. I'm sure. In that sense, it's easy to get discouraged in the ministry because it's really a minority of the people that you're speaking to that there's an impact. So what are some of the things that you do kind of spiritually, emotionally to prepare yourself or to prepare your volunteers for negative responses to what you're doing?
Yeah, I think part of that is a part of a broader question with, I think, evangelicals in general.
Sure, because that can come up in any ministry.
Yeah, we tend to want immediate results, and we look at it almost like sales. Like I made this pitch, and these people said no, and these people said yes. So I think the main thing is to just remember what I teach in my classes is that this is not about us, that this is a spiritual battle, and we're just messengers. And there's a lot of evidence in the Bible of God's messengers who were obedient and faithful and were still rejected by people. You think about Jeremiah, his ministry wasn't, in the world's eyes, very successful, but he was delivering a message. And so I just tell my volunteers that that this is our job is to go and offer help. And that's what our job is. Very simple. So if we say to someone, please take this information, we can help you, we can help your baby, I don't know your story, but please come talk to us, and they reject us and walk inside and abort their child, well then we did our job. And so it's just like with evangelism. I did my, if I share the gospel with a neighbor and they reject it at the time that I share it, I've done my job. I've been faithful to proclaim the truth. And then it's other than that, it's up to God to work in their hearts to receive it. So, but you're right. It is it's not like, you don't get an immediate often. You don't get an immediate earthly reward from it very often. So
sure. And that's something that really, like I said, can be true of any ministry. So it's important to have the right mindset going in. Now, I think there are 3 different denominations represented as far as the host of this show, and there are 2 other local youth ministers I do this with. And I think no matter what denomination you're a part of, something that is generally agreed on across Christianity is the sanctity of life and the importance of that. So I know that most Christians would agree that abortion is an issue, but I don't think a lot of people recognize how bad of an issue it is. I think it helps to kind of hear the numbers and know kind of the weight of it. So what are some numbers that you could give us to kind of put into perspective the scope of the problem?
Sure. Well, since Roe versus Wade, which was almost 46 years ago, there's about 62 million babies that have been lost to abortion in the United States alone. The numbers are pretty staggering. I mean, that's 62 million is about 1/5 of the population of the United States right now that's been aborted. So you think about abortion isn't just it's just not one number, but it's generations of people. 1 out of every 4 women, so 25%, and this is inside the church and out. 1 out of every 4 women of childbearing age, which they list as between 18 and 40, have had at least 1 abortion. And that's true both inside the churches and outside. And so you have these vast numbers of women who are post-abortive and men who are post-abortive and who are carrying that secret. It's amazing in any group. Whenever I speak to a group larger than, say, 50, about this topic, I always have someone come up after and tell me that they had an abortion, or their sister or their friend, and they wish they hadn't done it. And sometimes they tell me, Connor, sometimes they're like, I haven't told anybody this until now. So you have these staggering numbers of children that are dead, but you also have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of women who are post-abortive, and then they're carrying scars, and then their relationships are broken, and the men that are involved in it, they're very broken. Locally, Florida is the third largest state for abortions. We have 58 abortion clinics in Florida, which is over a tenth of the number nationwide. Now, the good news is that the numbers are going down. There used to be about 1.5 million abortions a year. The peak was 1980, 1.5 million a year. Now we're down to about 900,000 a year in the United States. So the numbers are going down, but there's still, obviously one abortion is too many, but there's a lot of momentum in the pro-life movement right now, but there's the numbers are really staggering when you think about it. And what's interesting about Florida is that Florida has a lot of Christians too. So right. California, when you look at California, it's a very liberal state. New York's very liberal, and their laws have been very pro-choice for a very long time. Florida is the third largest abortion state, and yet we have a large amount of Christians and Catholics and people who would agree, like you said, on the sanctity of life. And that's kind of what helped me get started, was sort of connecting pro-life belief into pro-life action. Like, okay, let's do something. Let's vote. We should be faithful to do that. We should obviously never encourage a woman to have an abortion. But what else are we doing in cities like St. Petersburg that have, 3 abortion clinics in our city? And Clearwater has 2, Tampa has 6. And so let's take our belief and put it into actual action, is what the goal was.
I love that. So what do you think the church can do to make that conversation, I don't know, I think it's something that people who are carrying those scars, when you get up and talk about it, they obviously feel a little more open to talking about it. But a lot of times going into the church, they feel like they're going to be judged if they talk about it. What can the church do to kind of help alleviate that fear?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think there's ways of preaching about it from the pulpit that you can do it in a way that can, if you're just quoting statistics to people and you know that there are people in your congregation who had abortions, you have to kind of measure how you do that and make sure you're doing that in a loving way. So I would say pastors can obviously need to put the issue in front of their people, but they need to do it in a way that is just drenched in the forgiveness that's offered through Jesus Christ, and that's drenched in grace and mercy, and saying, hey, if this is you, if you've done this, as far as the east is from the west, that's what Jesus has done with your sins. He's taken your sins away, and washed you white as snow. I think pastors should whenever abortion is mentioned, should always be offering that as making sure they're talking about it in a way that mercy is available. And it's hard because it's hard, like you even were saying, like you asked me, what are the statistics? A lot of pastors want to just land on the statistics. Oh, there's all these numbers and all these people, and how could we do this? And this is so wicked, and this is so bad. And it is, but there are people in your congregations who've had them, and so and who might be carrying that guilt. I think another area would be to make sure that churches are tapped into small groups and things like Project Rachel and pregnancy centers who offer post-abortion counseling. Those are huge for people to be able to come to a group that is, without shame, without judgment, and it's not, in front of the whole church, but it's a group of 10, 12 people who all have the same story. Project Rachel is a great one that I recommend. There's some a group called Passages of Hope in Clearwater that works with post-abortive men and women both. And that I think churches that are tapped in, not just there's this evil thing that we're doing in our country, and isn't this evil and isn't this horrible, but to say, and if this is what you've done, just like Paul somewhere says, talks about adultery and adulterers and idolaters and all these things. And he says somewhere, as were some of you, but you were washed, you were cleansed, you were set free, and that sense of sort of we can, pastors should be always offering forgiveness and grace to the women who have done this, and I think that's the challenge, because a lot of pastors just don't want to talk about it, or they want to talk about some other area of social justice. I've met so many pastors who are just like, yeah, well, we do this, or we do homeless outreach, or we do this and that. And there's nothing wrong with those things. But they don't want to touch, many don't want it. They may believe it, but they don't want to actually, put boots on the ground, so to speak. So.
Okay, so that's all. It's a big topic, and there's a lot to think about as far as our responsibility, in that as Christians. What is kind of your story, your testimony of how God led you to get involved in this type of ministry?
Well, I became a Christian when I was 16, and I was always in very solid churches. I was very blessed. My parents were divorced when I was a baby, and I didn't really have much of a father figure, especially early in my life, and so my pastors really became very influential, and the men in my churches were very influential and strong. I'm thankful for that. I remember when I became a teacher, my students would tell me about their youth pastors, and I was thinking, that's not what my youth pastor never did that. My youth pastor never put a burger in now if you've done this, please don't feel like I'm judging you, put a burger in a blender and drank it or anything like that.
I wouldn't do that.
You've never done that? That's the final, that's the senior year class at Liberty, is the putting the burger in.
No.
Okay, just kidding.
I'm not graduating from
okay. But so the kids, the students would tell me about all the fun they had at youth group, and we had fun too. But we also studied the Bible, and it was just very serious. But that's another generation. Anyway, so I've always considered myself pro-life. I never voted for anyone that wasn't pro-life. Knew abortion was murder. Knew biblically it was wrong, but I never really considered how prevalent it was. And so in 2007, which now is 11 years ago, hard to believe, my pastor, Jerry Caesar at Gulf Coast Community Church here in St. Petersburg, preached a sermon on abortion, and it preached it on Mother's Day. Most Mother's Day sermons are very, be nice to your mom, and moms are important, and, bring her flowers, and, put the seed down, kind of stuff, and so his was on abortion, and it really spoke to me that I should think about and research this more. Well, what I found out was that abortion was everywhere in Florida, and that it was everywhere in Pinellas County, and that there wasn't really any Protestant groups doing much other than. Now let me back up. There are Protestant groups that are supporting pregnancy centers, and there's Protestant groups that are talking about adoption, but there weren't any Protestant groups that were actually on site at the clinics. And so what I started to do was I started just hanging out at the clinics when I could, because I was still working several jobs, and I met some people who were doing this thing called sidewalk counseling, and they're just talking to the women as they went inside. And I'll never forget one day, this is probably 2009, it was a Saturday morning, and I could only go on Saturdays because I was working full-time. So it's Saturday morning, I'm walking up to the clinic, and there's this little priest. He passed away a few years ago. Father Vega was his name. He's probably 80 years old, probably 5'2", and he is, as I'm walking up, he is talking to this huge guy. This guy's got to be 6'8", and he's pointing at this dude, just telling him about the sanctity of life. And I thought, if that little priest can stand there and, not be afraid to speak out to people going in the clinic, I know I sure can. And I just thought, I want to find people who are doing this, and there wasn't really anyone doing it full time. And I just kept thinking, the Lord just kept pressing in, saying, this is your mission field. This is what you need to do. This is what you need to raise support. You need to, put this in front of my people as a mission, because it is a mission field. And we send missionaries all over the world, and we should. But we should also send them to the sidewalks here.
Right.
And the clinics, the Planned Parenthoods, they hate it when we're there because we drive their business down. And so if their businesses go down, if people aren't keeping appointments, if people are canceling, well, they lose money, they close down. And that's the whole goal. One of the goals.
Yeah.
And so that was about 2009-10. So about 2012, 6 years ago, I incorporated with the state. And I started sending out letters and just kind of flying blind, like, hey, I'm doing this ministry, would you like to support me? And my support grew, and I've sent out newsletters and did the social media stuff and got endorsed by by 3 churches here in St. Pete. And now I'm able to do it full time. And so it was a slow process. I think anything in ministry takes, 5 years sounds like a long time when you're young, Connor, but 5 years is really... to do anything really well and get something going, it takes 5 years, because people are just they've got their ministry, they've got their niche, and they know what they're doing, and it's uncomfortable to have someone come in, especially with what I'm saying, sure, because it's not easy, and there's a stigma, which we can talk about later if you want. There's a stigma about what I go in and I say I'm a sidewalk counselor. What's that? I stand outside abortion clinics and offer help to women. If they're tracking at all, they're thinking, oh, this person's crazy. This person yells at women. This person has bloody signs. This person cusses at and is, someone's going to shoot someone or be violent. So I have to unpack and kind of explain what I'm not to, and try to defeat that stigma, which is a challenge too. But that's I became full-time back in August a year ago, and we're going strong and really thankful to the Lord for what he's done.
I would like to talk about that more because I know to an extent what you're referring to, but some people might not realize what has created that stigma.
Well, if you go back a few years, there's been... there are still pro-lifers out there, I'll say this. There's still some pro-lifers out there that are more of the preaching type than the conversation type. So there's some pro-lifers that want to go to a clinic and just basically yell and sort of be really confrontational. So there are those that are out there, not so much locally here, but they are around. And my argument has always been, if I want to talk to someone, if I'm holding a sign around my neck and I'm yelling at them, they're going to run probably inside the clinic, which is not where I want them to go.
Right, exactly.
So I think there's some people who have a burden who think the Lord has told them to go and preach and be very confrontational. And that's just not what we're doing. If you go back to the 90s when the laws were different, you had people blocking entrances to the clinics, which I think was a great way to drive down business. But the laws have changed now, and now if you trespass at an abortion clinic, it's actually a federal crime. And it used to not be a federal crime. So you had guys who would go in and just get like a weekend in prison, and Christians would join arms and they would block the entrances, and the women couldn't get in, and then the cops would come and they'd arrest him for just a couple nights in city jail, and then they'd release him. And so but then the law changed, and now anyone that sets foot on their property could get a 20-year jail sentence. Wow. So it's changed a lot. And so, but there are those that want to be graphic and want to show bloody signs and want to be like that. And I'm just against that. Not because I don't believe that people should see what abortion is, but I think that people should see what abortion is in an environment where, like I think it'd be great for a youth pastor or a college ministry to show, if you were going to show pictures of it, to show pictures of it just for educational purposes, but not necessarily on the street is my take.
Yeah, definitely. So there's a time and a place for everything.
Absolutely.
Now, I think kind of how you approach doing the sidewalk counseling transitions well into my next question, which is, for a lot of people, this is a political argument, whereas as Christians, we realize that this is a spiritual war.
Right.
And there is a big difference there. And so there are non-believers that could build a good moral case against abortion.
Right.
Because there are non-believers that are pro-lifers. That being said, we know the foundation of morality, and that comes from God.
Right.
So when approaching a non-believer to talk to them about this, do you think it's better to start with building a moral case against abortion, or do you jump right in with the biblical argument?
That's a really good question. I think, and I'll do this by plugging something else I'm doing. I'm actually going to, hopefully, it's not 100% yet, but we're working on getting a debate going between me and a philosophy professor at USF, and here in maybe October or so, a couple months. And what I plan on doing there is basically just using, not necessarily using biblical arguments, but using moral and scientific arguments. The facts, I would start with the facts. The facts are that, 9 months before you were born, you were conceived. You have a birthday and you have a day you were conceived. Those are scientific facts. And so the minute you were conceived, that moment you became a separate person from your parents. And you became a separate person with a separate DNA structure, with a separate, with separate cells, with separate brain, everything. Those things are pretty much undisputed in the scientific world. Now the problem is the transition gets into, but because that child because that baby, that even if it's a week old or 9 months old, because that baby is residing inside of the mother, does that baby essentially have rights? That's what the argument is. Because scientifically you cannot argue with the fact that that's a separate person. You cannot argue with the fact that they've detected brain waves at 18 days. They've detected a heartbeat at 16 days. They've detected, by the time a woman knows she's pregnant, all of the DNA, everything that is needed for that person to be a living human person is there. They're a living human person. They're just really, really small, and they're living inside of their mother. And so they don't reject that's a baby. And then no atheist that's pro-choice goes up to someone that's pregnant and says, "Oh, what are you having? A frog? A dog? A tree? What's inside you?" They all know it's a baby.
Right.
But the issue is that does that baby's rights conflict with the mother's rights? And that's the main thing where we are in our society. If people know it's a baby, they just don't want to admit that baby has the same amount of rights as the mother does. And so that's what I'm going to be, talking about if we get this debate off the ground, is to say, how can you deny that child, because we know it has all the elements of personhood. It has, it's just very, very small, and it's living inside of the mother. Those are the only things that are distinct from it. And so that really, you can talk about God's image, you can talk about God's law, but really I think that going to that element with people that are unbelievers, I think is powerful, because they're expecting us to say, I'll just say this: if you argue science, a scientific thing, and a scientific argument, I think you're going to have more success with people. But if they reject that scientific argument, then that gets to the moral argument, because then they're denying what they don't want to see it. Just like people in Romans 1, they deny that there's a God. They don't want to believe. They close their eyes. They say they just suppress the truth. So we can put the facts in front of them and say, this is a baby. You're the only, why do you want to kill this child? What has this child done that deserves the death penalty, other than being inconvenient?
Sure. And then I think if they do accept the scientific argument, then still the next step is to talk about, the biblical reasons to make that line back to the gospel.
Absolutely, yeah. If they're saying, yeah, that's true, I'll say, well, where does that come from? Where does the spark of life come from? And why is this valuable? And really, our societies are really struggling with this. I think, we treat our dogs and our pets and our and our animals, better than people sometimes. We spend billions of dollars on our pets every year. We're confusing. We're I wouldn't be surprised. I think it was Spain or some maybe Italy that was debating whether a chimpanzee should have the same rights as a human a few years ago. I mean, we're really confused about this stuff, and yet at the same time, weirdly, technology and science is progressing to the point where you can see every stage of fetal development. So a woman may say, well, it's not a baby yet, but the next woman who's in, you have two women, one's 10 weeks along, they're both 10 weeks along. One woman says, it's not a baby yet, I don't want it, I want to abort it. The other person says, I can't wait to meet my baby, here's a picture of the ultrasound. I mean, that's the two, that's the argument where we are, and to be able to say to the woman, that you may not want that baby, but that doesn't mean nobody wants that baby. That doesn't mean no one will take your child. That doesn't mean no one will care for her. And so, I when I speak to groups, I say, we have things, we have so much junk in America. We have so much stuff, and we don't ever want to throw away our stuff. We'll either give it away or sell it. I mean, what is that site? Let Go. It's a thing for it's a like eBay or whatever. But you post your bookcase. You don't want to just you don't want to put it out to the trash, so you just post your bookcase on Let Go, and then someone will offer it. I mean, we have all this stuff, and yet with our children, with our babies, with the next generation, we can just so easily cast them away. And so what we're trying to do is, what I would say is, depending on the situation, is I would say, you have a conception date as well as a birth date. There was a time when you did not exist, and now you exist, and you existed before you were born for a few months, and what happened when you were conceived is when you were conceived, a new person came into existence, and so does that person have the same rights as every other person, even though it is small, and even though it lives inside its mother? That's the main argument right there.
So once you get into the biblical argument, we'll get into kind of the theology part of Theology Thursday. What are some scriptures that are kind of the go-to for you when it comes to sanctity of life?
Yeah, Jeremiah 1:5 is a big one. Before I formed you, I knew you. He's talking about ordaining Jeremiah. You got Psalm 119, Psalm 139. You've got in the law, in both Exodus and Deuteronomy, you've got places about the sanctity of life, and you have the death penalty, which is controversial even amongst Christians and Catholics too. But I mean, the idea of the death penalty comes from a idea of, at least in the Old Testament, was a sanctity of life, that when life is taken, then there needs to be life for life, because life is sacred and precious. So you go all the way back to Noah, and I think it's Genesis 9 when the covenants, when Noah received the covenant. Excuse me. Those are some of the places that I would go biblically. There are some some liberal Christians say, well, the soul doesn't enter the body until the first breath is taken. In fact, I heard that Bill Clinton's pastor, when he was in seminary or in college, I guess, told him that, and so Bill Clinton was really happy to hear that, because he was a very pro-choice, pro-abortion president. That's not, you can't really support that biblically, because it talks about God's knowledge of the person that He's created being pre-birth. Sure. And so those are some places that I would go to build the biblical argument.
Okay, that's all really good, and then we're going to be able to put some links in the show notes so people can find out more about your ministry and be able to support it if they feel led. So tell our listeners how they can get involved.
Sure. Well, you can go to my website, which is Florida Preborn Rescue.com. I'm on Facebook. My last name's spelled Mahurin, Mahurin. I'm the only Scott J. Mahurin on there. And if you click on it and you see a bald guy with a beard, that's me. You can follow me that way. We are doing some great stuff here locally the next few months. We're doing 40 Days for Life, which, if you're in the area locally, is just a prayer vigil for 40 days. We're asking each church in St. Pete to come and pray for one day. And it's just a prayer vigil. We go to the clinic on Central Avenue, and we pray all day. And people come in shifts. They take an hour. So you can check that out too at 40daysforlife.com/St. Petersburg. My email is just Florida Preborn Rescue at yahoo.com. I'm available to come speak to churches or groups or youth groups or whatever. Yeah, I think that's it.
Awesome. Well, we'll include the link to your website in the show notes so people can look at that. And remember, if you have any questions, if you are a leader of a local ministry or you know a leader of a local ministry that you would like us to talk about on the show, you can email us at theologythursdaypodcast@gmail.com. We are on Instagram and Twitter, so you can follow us on there for updates. Scott, thank you so much for being on the show today.
You're welcome.
And sharing this information with us. I think it's been a great conversation, and I hope that it's been beneficial to our listeners.
Good to be with you. Thank you.